Hi guys, so today we're studying the radius bone. This was the only bone left in our upper limb section. Um, so let's start with the radius bone. This is the radius bone, okay? Um, तो हमारे पास सबसे पहले जब हम रेडियस बोन की बात करते हैं तो हमारे पास एज वी कैन सी यहाँ पे एक हेड है और हेड के बिल्कुल inferiorly we have the neck and then that neck extends out a bit to show you the radial tuberosity, right? So here you can see the neck, the head, and then we can see the neck, and then this is the radial tuberosity. Um, okay. So this is the radial tuberosity, this is your head, and this is your neck, right? Moving on, the most important thing that you should know is when we have the bones of the forearm, not the arm. The arm, the bone is humerus. For the forearm, we have the radius and ulna. The ulna and radius together form an interosseous kind of joint. When we say interosseous, mean that there's an interosseous membrane that connects the ulna and radius together. Now, this interosseous membrane obviously has attachments on these bones, right? So if you sort of try to imagine that the radius is on the lateral side and the ulna is on the medial side of your forearm. So if the radius is on your lateral side, the interosseous border will be on the medial side. And since the ulna, the bone is on the medial side, the interosseous membrane or border will be on the lateral side. As we can appreciate here that the medial interosseous border is on the medial border of the radius. The other borders and surfaces, we'll do it as we move on. Since it's a long bone, it has three parts, a proximal end, a distal end, and a shaft. Moving on. Now, as you can see that there's a head and a neck and a radial tuberosity. The radial tuberosity is really important because when you're supinating and pronating your arm, the radial tuberosity helps to form a proximal radio-ulnar joint with the ulna. So there's a proximal radio-ulnar joint, as you can see, and then there's a distal radio-ulnar joint, right? So here we can see that there's a proximal radioulnar joint and here there's a distal radioulnar joint. These joints allow for the pronation and supination of your arm, and we're going to see that in the following slides. Now, when we talk about the upper extremity, we have the head, we have the articular surface. Here we can see the articular surface, and then we have the radial tuberosity. And between the articular surface of the radial and the tuberosity, there's the neck. You can appreciate that here also. Now, when we talk about the head, the radial head has a cylindrical form. You can see that this is a little cylindrical in its form, right? The radial head has a cylindrical form. On its upper surface is a shallow cupped fovea. So basically, this upper surface, it is like a shallow cupped fovea for the articulation with the capitulum of the humerus. So you should always remember that when we talk about the humerus and its articulation at the elbow joint, the humerus, the capitulum of the humerus articulates with the radial head at the humeroradial joint. Okay. Now, the circumference or outer boundary of the head is smooth. It is broad medially where it articulates with the radial notch of the ulna, narrow in the rest of its extent, which is embraced by the annular ligament. There's an annular ligament which sits on top of this head, and I'm going to show it to you in the next slides. The deepest point in the fovea is not axisymmetric with the long axis of the radius. As you can see, the deepest part is not really right in the middle of the radius, creating a cam effect during pronation and supination. Moving on, the head is supported on a round, smooth. Uh, when we talk about the cam effect, let me stop there and explain this. Okay, so the cam effect basically means that the point at which the radial head articulates with the ulna when it's moving in pronation and supination, it's not asymmetric. So the point at which the radius will be moving with the ulna, it's not exactly you can't really divide the radius into halves and say that the half of the radius is moving and the half isn't, or it's moving exactly in its mid-axis. So the fact that it refers to the way the shape of the radial head moves when we're having supination and pronation actions at the elbow joint, it's not really axisymmetric. And this leads to changes in the relationship between the radial head and the humerus and ulna during these movements. So the radial head has a it's like a complex, often elliptical shape, and it's not perfectly symmetrical. That's what they're trying to say. And the cam effect is basically the lever effect, where the radial's head's position relative to the humerus and ulna change as the forearm rotates. Um, Moving on. Now we have the neck. The neck is the head. So with the head, when we studied the cylindrical head, it is supported on a round, smooth, and constricted portion called the neck, on the back of which is a slight ridge for the insertion of the part of the supinator muscle. Now we talk about the tuberosity. Beneath the neck of the radius on the medial side is an eminence, the radial tuberosity, as you can appreciate here. This is just the radial tuberosity itself has an anterior surface and a posterior surface, right? So when we talk about the radial tuberosity, we can see that it has two surfaces, an anterior surface and a posterior surface, right? Can you appreciate that here? It has two surfaces. The posterior rough portion is for the insertion of the tendon of the biceps brachii. I'll show it to you here. Can you see this rough part? So this is for the insertion of the biceps brachii tendon, and the anterior smooth portion is the part on which a bursa is interposed between the tendon and the bone. Bursas, I told you, are like soft cushions. They help to reduce friction between the joints. Now we need to appreciate this. Remember, I told you that I'll show you the annular ligament later on. So this is the annular ligament. When we talk about the elbow joint, we have the humerus, the ulna, and the radius. Now the head of the radius has an annular ligament that is participating in the elbow joint. We have the humerus, then we have the capitulum area that is articulating with the radius head, and then this is the annular ligament. Then we have the trochlea, and then we have the ulna, right? So you can see that this is the trochlear notch of the ulna, right? Can you appreciate that here? Now, when we talk about the elbow joint, we're actually making three joints, and we're going to study those three joints that are all combined to form a complex elbow joint, right? We're going to do them superficially because later on we're going to do a proper video on the elbow joint. So superficially, we have a humero-ulnar joint. Can you appreciate that here? This is the humero-ulnar joint. So this is the humerus and this is the ulna. So the trochlea of the humerus articulates with the trochlear notch of the ulna, as I showed you here, that the trochlea of the humerus articulates with the trochlear notch of the ulna. It's a hinge joint allowing for flexion and extension. Now, this does not mean that the elbow joint is a hinge joint. We're just saying that the humero-ulnar joint, the humerus and the ulna, they together form a hinge joint that allows for flexion and extension. Moving on to the humero-radial joint. So this is the humero-ulnar joint and this is the humero-radial joint, where I told you that the capitulum of the humerus is articulating with the head of the radius. So the humero-ulnar joint, again, the capital of the humerus, which is not labeled here, articulates with the head of the radius, and it allows for rotational movements of the forearm and pronation, that is pronation and supination. And I told you that the head of the radius, and it's not axisymmetrical, so it's not like an exact cylindrical head, which is why we have a cam effect, a lever effect when we talk about pronation and supination. Okay, now we have another joint. This is the third joint of our elbow joint. This is the radio-ulnar joint. What joint? Radio-ulnar joint. When we talk about radio-ulnar joint, I told you that there is an interosseous membrane between these two bones. So we have a proximal radio-ulnar joint and a distal radio-ulnar joint. The proximal radio-ulnar joint, when we talk about that, the head of the radius articulates with the radial notch of the ulna. So if you remember, we studied that the ulna has a radial notch here, and this head of the radius articulates with it to form a pivot type synovial joint, allowing rotational of the radius around the ulna. Now this joint allows for rotation of the radius over the ulna. Why does the radius need to rotate over the ulna? To allow for pronation and supination. Now we have some few ligaments that we're going to study later on when we do the elbow joint again, but let's touch on them briefly here. We have the joint capsule, which obviously covers the joint of the elbow joint itself. Then we have an annular ligament, which allows for the capitulum of the humerus and the head of the radius to articulate and form a joint. And then we have an ulnar collateral ligament and we have a radial collateral ligament. These collateral ligaments allow for better movement, protection, and reduced friction of the elbow joint. Okay, they help in stability of the elbow joint. Moving on now, widget stickers and templates of the distal radius and ulna. This is really important because they will ask you in vivas or past paper questions about this specific articulation of the scaphoid and the lunate. right? So we have the ulnus and radius that extend distally to form the wrist joint. And when we talk about the wrist joint, we talk about which bones are participating with the radius here. So tell me which bones will participate with the distal end of the radius. We have the lunate and we have the scaphoid, which are part of the carpal bones, right? So they really help in forming the wrist joint. Now, as you can see that there's an ulnar notch here to allow for the ulna to form a distal radio-ulnar joint. As I can show you before on this slide, we had a proximal radio-ulnar joint and we had a distal radio-ulnar joint. So here we're forming the distal radio-ulnar joint. Now the distal end of the radius is large end and it's quadrilateral in form. As you can see, it's quadrilateral in form, right? The joint surfaces, it is provided with two articular surface, one below for the carpus. Carpus, when we say carpus, we're talking about the scaphoid and lunate, and another at the medial side for the ulna. Um, so we have a joint for the carpus bones, and then we have a joint for the ulna. The carpal articular surface is triangular concave. As you can see, we're talking about this. So this surface is triangular concave smooth and divided by a slight anterior-posterior ridge. So this is the slight anterior-posterior ridge they're talking about. As you can see here, this is the slight anterior posterior ridge that they're talking about, and into two parts of these. The lateral triangular one articulates with the scaphoid bone. So this lateral triangular one articulates with the scaphoid bone. Okay. Can I show it to you here? Yes. So this lateral triangular one, this is the lateral part, triangular one, that articulates with the scaphoid bone, and this medial one articulates with the lunate bone. Okay, the lunate quadrilateral one is with the lunate bone. The articular surface of the ulnar is called the ulnar notch. Um, the articular surface of the for the ulna is called the ulnar notch, which is also the sigmoid cavity of the radius. It is narrow, concave, smooth, and articulates with the head of the ulna. These two articular surfaces are separated by a prominent ridge to which the base of the triangular articular disc is attached. This disc separates the wrist joint from the distal radio-ulnar articulation. Remember, I told you there was a triangular disc when we studied the ulna, and I told you how the wrist joint is forming. So that disc separates the wrist joint from the distal radio-ulnar articulation, and it attaches to the base of it attaches to the prominent ridge here. So we're talking about this area now, right? Okay, which is also giving the separation to the area that is attached to the ulna to form the distal ulnar joint. I really hope this is clear, guys. Um, Moving on. Okay, so now the borders are very important, but they're pretty simple when it comes to the radius because it's very easy to identify these borders because it's very easy to identify the tuberosity. So when you talk about the tuberosity has an anterior part and a posterior part. The posterior part was roughened to give an attachment to the biceps brachii tendon. Now, when we talk about the anterior border starts from the radial tuberosity, the anterior part of the radial tuberosity, and it goes down to extend to the what part? To the styloid process, anteriorly the styloid process. So we have, can you see that we have the, wait, can I show it to you here better? Um, okay, so let me show it to you better. Yes. It was somehow blurring my background first. Okay. So this is the anterior part and this is the posterior rough part, right? So the anterior border starts from the radial tuberosity and runs all the way down to the anterior border of the styloid process. So this is the styloid process. It has an anterior border and a posterior border, an anterior part and the posterior part. So anteriorly, it runs to the anterior part of the styloid process here and starts from the anterior part of the radial tuberosity. It gives the attachment to the flexor digitorum superficialis. If you do remember this, heads up. If you don't, no problem. Posterior border. When we talk about the posterior border, so this is the radius. We turn it around and we go to the posterior roughened part of the radial tuberosity. You start from here and then posteriorly run to the posterior part of the styloid process. So the styloid process anteriorly is ending the anterior border and posteriorly it's ending the posterior border, right? Now, I told you that there's a very sharp border, the medial interosseous border. It's very sharp. It is literally when you pick up the bone, it's like a prism, and it's the most easiest, sharpest border to identify. So it's the sharpest border, and it starts. Can you see where the sharpened area starts? You just start from here, literally. Okay. So you start from the sharp area and you go down to see that this here, it encloses a triangular space. Can you appreciate this triangular space? So when the sharp border goes down, it sort of makes a triangular space like this. ठीक हो गया like this. So that triangular area, why is it important? Because it gives attachment to the interosseous membrane. Okay, so that's your medial border for you. Here we can also appreciate these borders. Now another thing, when we talk about the surfaces, okay. Here we can appreciate them. So which bone, let me understand this picture a little bit. Okay. So when you look at a picture, you orient yourself with which side you're on, which section is being shown. So this is your radius and this is your ulna. As I told you, the radius is always the lateral bone, right? And ulna is the medial bone. So you can appreciate that the membrane that is running between these two bones is the interosseous membrane because I'm showing you a cross section of it, right? So this is the anterior surface, this is the posterior surface. When we talk about, so this is the anterior surface and this is the posterior surface and this is the interosseous membrane. So these parts are the interosseous border, the interosseous border of ulna and interosseous border of radius. And when you pick up the ulna and radius, the interosseous borders are pretty sharp, right? Then we have these posterior borders and we have the anterior border. I told you that when we talk about the radius, we have a radial tuberosity. The tuberosity gives the give anteriorly gives the start of the anterior border and posteriorly gives the start of the posterior border. And we run down to the styloid process. Anteriorly, the styloid process ends the anterior border, and posteriorly, the styloid border ends the posterior border. So it's pretty easy if you follow the radial tuberosity to the styloid process, and the sharpest border is the medial borders. These are your three borders when it comes to radius. Moving on, the anterior surface. Now, when you talk about the anterior surface, can you look at this red part here? So here, if on the bone, I can show you the anterior surface, but I don't think you'll be able to, I think you can see it here. So we have an anterior oblique line, and we have a posterior oblique line. So can you see this? It's a little curved shaped. Yes, this one. This is your anterior oblique line, right? So it's present on the upper surface of the anterior surface of the radius. So this is everything that's shaded red is your anterior surface. It lies between the anterior and interosseous borders. It is concave above and wider below. Now there's a nutrient foramen present. The important part of the nutrient foramen is that it's directed upwards. Why is it directed upwards? As the bone is of growing end. So the upper part is the growing end of the bone, right? So that's why the nutrient foramen is pointed upwards, and sometimes they even ask you this in the viva. The nutrient artery, which nutrient artery is present in the radius? It is the anterior interosseous artery. Now attachment. We have some attachments here. The flexor pollicis longus originates from the upper two-thirds of the anterior surface of the radius, and the pronator quadratus arises from the lower one-fourth of anterior surface and a small triangular area on the anterior surface, right? The small triangular area is very easy to see. Okay. So this small triangular area. Okay. So we have the flexor pollicis longus on the anterior surface, the upper two-thirds, and then we have a lower one-fourth that is giving attachment to the pronator quadratus. Right? Now we have the posterior surface. Can you appreciate the blue part here, the posterior surface? Now the posterior surface lies between the posterior and interosseous borders. It's convex, and we have an attachment of the abductor pollicis longus and extensor pollicis brevis. These two arise from the upper part of the posterior surface of the radius. We are left with one surface, that's our lateral surface. The lateral surface is this green surface that we can appreciate it, this green surface, right? So the lateral surface lies between the anterior and posterior borders. It is entirely convex. In the upper one-third, a rough oblique ridge is present known as the oblique line, which extends downwards and forwards. Anteriorly, I showed you the anterior oblique line, and posteriorly, there's a, sorry, not posteriorly, laterally. I'll just show it to you. Wait. This is the anterior oblique line, which I've already shown you. Yeah. So I showed you the anterior oblique line. Now I'm going to show you the uh, oblique line that is present on the lateral surface. Wait. So actually, I can't really see it on this bone. I think it's because it's synthetic, but we can just imagine it, right? I really can't make it up on this bone. The lower part is wider above and continuous with the neck attachments. Now we have two attachments here. The supinator inserts in the middle of the lateral surface and the supinator inserts on the upper part of the lateral surface. So the supinator is attaching to two parts of the surface, right? Let me make it clear. So I tried to open up an image for you. Can you see this, please? Okay, here we can see that there are two attachments on the radius for the supinator, right? So it's also inserting in the middle of the lateral surface and it's also inserting on the upper part of the lateral surface, right? Okay, moving on. Now we talk about the lower end. Now the lower end is a little complicated. I really hope you guys can brace yourselves. There are five surfaces of the lower end, right? So if I hold the bone, so we have five surfaces on this quadrilateral surface, right? We have an anterior and posterior side, and we have a medial and lateral side, and then we have an inferior side. So we have five surfaces. Um, I put an image here. Yeah. So can you see this? Can you see posterior, anterior, lateral? Right? So when we talk about the inferior surface, we can see that this is the styloid process of the ulna, this is the styloid process of the radius that can help you identify the medial and lateral areas, right? So this image is actually using right and left. We will be saying medial and lateral always, right? So this is your radius and this is your lateral side. This is your medial side. This is your ulna. These are the styloid processes, which are giving us an indication of the medial and lateral sides. And this is the posterior side and this is the anterior side. So the anterior surface of lower end, we're talking about this anterior surface, has a thick ridge that separates the anterior surface of the shaft of radius from the anterior surface of lower end of radius. There's an attachment here, which is the flexor retinaculum ligament. The flexor retinacular ligament is attached to the ridge-like anterior surface of the lower end. So I told you that this is the styloid process, right? And this is your anterior surface. Okay, this is your anterior surface. So here there is a ridge. Let me show it to you. So this ridge is important because it separates the anterior surface of the radius shaft from the lower end of the radius, and this area gives attachment to the flexor retinaculum. Okay. Now we have a posterior surface. I know this is really long, the posterior surface, but it's important because it has three grooves, right? So can you see that there are three grooves here? This is also a groove, and one, two, and three, right? So this, this, and then this. So we have these three grooves, right, on the posterior side. Can you appreciate this Lister's tubercle? So this is the let me this one. So this is your Lister's tubercle, and on either side of the Lister tubercle, we have two impressions, and then we have two other grooves. So let's start from the most, it's basically the posterior surface of the lower end is broad and has three shallow grooves and tubercles. Dorsal tubercle of Lister is a small pointed tubercle on the posterior surface of lower end. This is the Lister's tubercle that I showed you. It's very important, please. This is really important, okay? So this is the Lister's tubercle. And then we have grooves. The posterior surface has four shallow grooves. Relations of the grooves. There's a lateral groove through the groove on the posterior surface of styloid process. Here there's a groove, right? The tendons of abductor pollicis longus and extensor pollicis brevis pass. Then there's a second groove between the Lister tubercle and the styloid process. So this is the second groove. Now this second groove gives passage to extensor carpi radialis longus and extensor carpi radialis brevis tendons. Then there's an oblique groove this is medial to listus tubercle. So this is the listed tubercle. We are talking about a groove that is here. Okay. So this gives passage to extensor pollicis longus tendon, and then there's a fourth groove which gives here. This is the fourth groove here which gives passage to extensor indicis and extensor digitorum tendons. You really have to learn this, and if you don't want to learn the attachments now, if you only want to focus on the osteology of the bone, you need to know that there's a listed tubercle here. There are two grooves laterally, and then there's one groove medially. So we have four grooves and three tubercles. Moving on to the medial surface of lower end, we're talking about this area, this part, right? So the medial surface of the lower end, as I told you, has this triangular shaped area. It is narrow and has a concavity to form the ulnar notch. This is your ulnar notch, the narrow concavity to form the ulnar notch. To form the inferior radioulnar joint, a ridge separates the ulnar notch from the anterior surface. And I already told you that a triangular articular disc separates this part of the radius from the ulna. And it's easy to know that there's a triangular disc here because this area itself is also triangular. Remember that. There's a lateral surface of the lower end. Now this was our uh, this was our medial surface, the triangular part, and now we have a lateral surface that is near the styloid process, right? So the lateral surface is continuous with the lateral border and forms the styloid process. It is projected downwards and is prominent. Obviously, the styloid processes are always prominent. It gives attachment to the brachioradialis. The brachioradialis inserts at the base of the styloid process. So here the brachioradialis inserts itself, and the radial collateral ligament is attached to the tip of the styloid process. There's an inferior surface which I told you is quadrangular, has a triangular part, has a quadrangular part. So this inferior surface of the lower end is concave and triangular. It is covered with articular cartilage and participates in the wrist joint. If you remember, our triangular part was articulating with the scaphoid, and our little quadrangular part was articulating with the lunate. That's it. Thank you guys. I really hope this was helpful. I'm sorry if it's too long, but I tried. Thank you guys.